Okay, people, we are going to look at some pictures showing the levels of society in the Middle Ages. So we'll go ahead and start through that. So we're gonna overlook like the levels of society, like what your station of society was, like whether you were a king or a nobleman or a soldier or a peasant, how the politics work and religion and so forth. Okay. Let's see if I can move. All right, so we got our first little pyramid right here. So, of course, at the top, we have the king. The king owned all the land in the country and made the laws. He gave an area of land called a fief to rich lords and nobles. Rich lords and nobles are these little guys down here. So the nobles made up the nobility, and they were lords, and they were vassals to the king. So they were servants to the king. So in return, the lords and nobles agreed to supply the king with soldiers and horses for his army. So they supplied him with soldiers and money and infrastructure and things the kings needed. And in turn, the king gave them things he had. Money, food, building supplies to make castles for themselves, and things like that. And below them, in return, these knights fought for the noble. So like down here, so the soldiers the nobles gave to the king came from this level, the knights. So the knights fought for the nobles, and they fought for the king, and of course they also protected the peasants, so the regular people, the serfs. And serf basically translates to servant, or in some ways a slave. So that's how this works. So the king owned all the land in the country. He was so the way they selected kings back then was there's a verse in the Bible that said something to the effect of, the king, God picks the king to rule over the people. And so that's they just took that and ran with it, and they picked one king in the very beginning, and whenever that king has a son, that king's son will become the next king, and so on and so forth. So the king has a responsibility to have male sons, or to have male children, so they can carry on the line. But that doesn't always work out, and they have his wife will have a lot of daughters, and he's in a pickle at that point. All right, so the king gives respect to the lords, and they have loyalty to give military aid to the king. They offer protection and food and shelter to the knights and soldiers, and this also trickles down to the peasants. The knights give protection to the serfs and peasants who work the land of the nobles and king, and they provide food and from the farms and plantations. And it was a very good. This is known as the feudal system. It's known as feudalism, not capitalism, but feudalism. Capitalism is the next step after feudalism. And this system worked for many thousand years until it didn't anymore. And we'll see, we'll may be able to see before the end of the year how that turned out. All right. Yeah, so this is feudal society. So you have the king, the lords, the vassals, the knights, and the peasants and town people. So the knights and vassals are basically the same thing. The knights protect the town people and the lands of the king and lords, and the vassals are basically the soldiers. They protect the lords and king, and like that. So the higher you go up, the more power is concentrated. So the lords and vassals have power. The knights have power over the peasants and town people, but mostly they just protect them. But that's how it looks. That's how power looks in feudal society. In some cases, the peasants and townspeople can move up to be nobles, but you had to become educated, and it was not very easy to become educated back then. Most people were illiterate, didn't know how to read or write. They were given information by kind of word of mouth, just like speaking to each other. That's actually how news, like the daily news was kind of given out. Like this guy would stand out in like the town courtyard or square or something, and he would like kind of yell out the news to everybody, like, oh, this person in this town died today, blah, blah, blah. They were known as a herald. They would herald the news. And that's how people got information. So yeah. So there's this picture, but you have right here, we have, so there's the pyramid again, but I want you to pay attention to this. So the political system, it was a feudalism, it was the political system of the time, it was decentralized. That means power wasn't very concentrated. That's the reason why it was decentralized, is because there was large swaths of land, and it was difficult for, I mean, there was no telephones or text messaging back then. Everything traveled by letters and foot. So what the king did is he gave a lot of his power to the lords to rule over parts of his land in place of him, where the king had final say, but the nobles had a lot of control over the peasants and knights of their area, and they reported back, and the nobles that were in control of that land reported back every now and then to the king about how things are going. But of course the king doesn't care as long as he's being paid loyalty and military aid and getting fed. Dependent upon the relationship between the members of the nobility, lord and his vassals administered justice and were the highest authority in their land. All right. And the economic system was manorialism. So agriculture, the basis for the wealth. So they didn't have a lot of meat. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, agriculture, meat is a part of agriculture. So a lot of meat, growing and farming was how life functioned. So land's divided up into self-sufficient manors. So you see in this picture right here, there's this castle, and around it you can see there's like some people farming, and that's how that kind of worked. So there would be like this large flat land, and there'd be like this castle somewhere around it, and the peasants would work for whichever lord owned that castle, and so they'd work and they'd give the food and stuff to them, and in return the peasants would be able to live here and have shelter from the weather, or invading armies or thieves or people that want to do them harm. So they would be able to live inside the walls of this castle, and if not inside the walls, they would be able to live like very close to it, and they would be allowed to come inside if there was any kind of threat. So yeah, the barter, they had a barter system, which is where you don't use money, you just kind of trade items. So like, I'm going to trade you my chickens for your cow. That's how that would work. Alright, so this is what peasants usually dressed in. They had like these cloaks, and they had something like a hood maybe to keep them warm, because most of the year it was probably pretty cold outside in Europe. And they would like bundle up the crops in these little ropes to carry them on, and they would wear these hose, something like a coif, a tunic, and there'd probably even be a pecking order among the peasants. So a peasant one peasant may be kind of over or like lead the rest of the peasants, and this is kind of a building or like a house they may have lived in. So you see, it was pretty simple. It was made of stone and wood, and it had like a thatched roof with a straw on top. In some parts of Europe, they still make these houses, and people still live in them. They're a little bit more modern, but it's just kind of like, So yeah, they had a bed with the mattress made out of straw and grass, like the animals would sometimes be in the house with you. Kind of gross. Whole house would smell like boo-boo. But yeah. Peasants didn't live very well compared to the nobles and kings. So this is how the nobles and kings usually lived. So here's how they dressed. They dressed in very fine clothing, had lots of jewelry. They would pay respects to the nobles, or like the more powerful nobles, or like maybe perhaps this is a king right here. This is definitely a king right here, and as you can see, all the people. So these are like the vassals or knights, and you can definitely see that they have weapons. So they're vassals or knights. The people without weapons, like these women right here, they're nobles, and their job is to pay respect to the king and have loyalty for him. If you don't show loyalty to the king, you can lose your station as a noble, and you can end up having to be a peasant sometimes. So yeah, as you can see here, he's like paying respects to the king and queen. There's another example. Looks like somebody got their head cut off right here. I don't know what he did, but looks like this guy thinks he deserved it. So he's like, very good. Okay. So politics. So whenever a new king was picked to rule over the country, the religious leader of that land, so this may be the Pope, I believe, the Pope from Rome. So when Saint Peter from the Bible, Peter, one of Jesus' disciples, died, he created this tradition where people would kind of rule over the church after he died. So Saint Peter was the first pope. He was the first, and basically what a pope does is he's the substitute for Christ, or for Jesus Christ on earth until he comes back. And they call him the vicar of Christ, the kind of like the stand-in for Christ. And in Italian, pope means dad, or papa. So the Pope is the father of the church. And one of the jobs or duties of the Pope is to anoint the new king of Christian kingdoms. So when a new king is selected to rule over a land, the Pope anoints him king. So it's like a way of saying, like, God anoints you as king. I'm the vicar of Christ on earth until the second coming of Christ, and I agree to you being king, and here is your crown. God agrees with you being king, basically. So that's kind of how religion and politics. There was no separation of church and state back then. Church and state were the same thing. Okay. There we go. We have a Christ on the cross. So obviously Christianity was a very, very important part of medieval life. But there were many different, how would you say, denominations or types of Christianity. So like in England, there's something called the Church of England, because one of the kings of England decided he didn't want it to be part of the Catholics, and he split from the church in Rome and made the Church of England. Yeah, there were many different types of, mostly it was Church of England, and which is known as Protestantism, and Catholicism. Here we get some more pictures of that. And of course the Virgin Mary was a very important figure. And that's all. So please check in the instructions for what your assignment is over this, and thanks for watching.